My name is Leon and you've found the Ultralight Airplane Workshop. This is the fourth part of a video series covering the creation of a mold for the rudder of the UWS-1 Ultralight airplane. This part 4 that you're looking at had been the last half of the previous part 3, but it was too long. I cut the last half off, and now we're calling it part 4. So the start of this video just kind of jumps in where the last part 3, left off. If you've been finding my videos through Facebook or through web searches or even through the website, but you don't have a YouTube account, you should really think about getting a YouTube account. You can subscribe to the channel and then hit the little bell button and you'll get notified anytime a video comes out so you won't miss any videos. If you'd like to be able to support the channel but you really can't afford to go to Patreon and spend a few dollars to become a patron, think about subscribing if you haven't done so already. Adding more subscribers makes YouTube think it's a great channel and it'll recommend it to other viewers and we'll get more subscribers and the channel will grow and we can keep building airplanes and restoring airplanes and designing airplanes. And to provide a little spoiler, we got a mold. Our plug had a little trouble. Let's talk about the next steps here. Now this is only 4 layers of 300 gram fiberglass. By itself, this is going to be too flimsy to use as a mold. It needs to have stiffeners. And I want it to be able to set flat on the table. My plan then is to put stiffeners on here. I'm going to remove this peel ply and I'm going to start gluing some foam on here that will be the basis of the core for my stiffeners. So I'm going to have a stiffener running along here at this highest spot. And I'm going to have a stiffener run here along this back edge, roughly where I'll use tacky tape. And then of course I'll have stiffeners running along here where I'll be using tacky tape on the mold. I will also be sticking some stiffener ribs every so often along here. I haven't decided yet how often. And then there will be a smaller stiffener along here. Let's get to it. This peel ply needs to come off before I can glue down my stiffeners and ribs, so let's do that. I think I finally found a good use for that epoxy tooling putty. I'm using it on the ends of my foam cores to glue these cores down to the mold. It worked pretty good for that. So it fills up the gaps between the core and the mold, squishes out a little bit, and it works great as an adhesive. This is the foam core of what is going to be a fiberglass sandwich to help stiffen this mold. And it's also going to be one of the walls of the box that the mold is going to sit on, along with a foam fiberglass sandwich along the trailing edge. It'll also be part of the box. I'm also adding a foam fiberglass sandwich along this front edge to stiffen it. Here's where I decided to try another experiment, and instead of using that tooling putty, I decided to use some Cradle thickened epoxy and see how well that worked compared to the tooling putty. I have to admit, I kind of favor the Cradle thickened epoxy to the tooling putty. I tried several different ways of putting this thickened epoxy into fillets, where the foam core joins the mold that's already been made. And this is the first one that I tried, and this is dipping my stirring stick down into my cup of epoxy and then trying to apply it in a fillet. Now this does work, but it's not efficient. It takes quite a bit of going over it and adding more epoxy to really get a good fillet. I added some of these little short rib stiffeners because I didn't feel that the 4 layers of the 300 gram per square meter fiberglass I used was really stiff enough. So these are just to help alleviate that issue. I had put those fillets in earlier to try to prevent voids where that fiberglass I'm going to put on later goes down around those corners. But now I'm trying to do the similar sort of thing by rounding over the edges, these top edges of the foam. If I don't do that, then trying to get that fiberglass to go around sharp edges would also create voids, and by sanding it down to a nice radius, I can avoid that. I didn't show you my second experiment of trying to create those fillets, and that was where I just stuck my finger down in the epoxy and then used it to apply the epoxy down into the fillet areas. And while that worked a little bit better than using a stirring stick, it created a heck of a mess. That epoxy got all over your hands, and then you had to really be careful about what you touched, otherwise you spread epoxy all over the place. So I wouldn't recommend that. This is my third experiment in applying the epoxy, and this worked fantastic. This is where I took a 1-gallon Ziploc bag, I put the epoxy down into the bag, down into one corner, I twisted it up pretty tight, and then I stepped about a 1/4 inch off of the corner of that bag, and then I could squeeze the bag and squeeze the epoxy out and into a lovely bead down in that corner. And that worked great for putting the correct amount of epoxy down in there. Nice uniform bead, and then all I had to do is come back with a stirring stick and drag it along there. Made a fantastic fillet. Now comes the fiberglass of these fiberglass foam core sandwiches. This took a long time. Now I cut out all of these fiberglass pieces ahead of time. I knew how big each one had to be and had them all cut out and ready to go. I put 2 layers of fiberglass on each face. Each face got its own piece of fiberglass. I overlapped each of those pieces over this top edge. That means each face had 2 layers, but each top edge had 4 layers. And this just made the top edge just a little more robust, because when we get that flipped over, it's actually going to be the bottom of the mold. And in case I drop it, it's more likely to survive without damage. These stiffening ribs were given a slightly different treatment. Instead of having 4 pieces of fiberglass, 2 on each side, having them all overlap over the top, there was only 2 pieces. Started on the base from one side, ran up the side, over the top, down the other side, and to the base again. So there was only 2 pieces all the way around on these. Since I only used 4 ply of fiberglass on the surface mold, and I knew there was a possibility that would be too flexible, I want to give myself an option to come back and put a couple more ply in there. And I would put it down in between these ribs against this green surface that you see here. In order to help me do that, I'm going to put some peel ply in all along these fillets. That will make it so I don't have to sand nearly as much if I really do decide I have to go ahead and put some more fiberglass in here. Without the peel ply, I have to put a lot of sanding down in this bevel area where there's epoxy out on the green and it's cured down to a smooth finish. That'd have to be sanded before I put down more plies of fiberglass. We're getting close to the moment of truth. The epoxy is cured, and it's time to rip off that peel ply. As I was editing this video, I realized I had forgotten to film something. I didn't film removing the cradle from the plug and the mold. That's what you're looking at here. This is the plug and the mold. It's been flipped over, so now it's oriented in the way I plan on using it when I'm using the mold. And the cradle has been removed. The cradle would have been sitting on top of this after being flipped over. I loosened the screws holding the plug extension to the plug, and I wedged a little bit of tongue depressor, a stirring stick, under this back edge and started to try to pop this plug extension loose. And initially it popped pretty good, but then it didn't completely pop. I figured it'd all pop at once. That darn thing was kind of sticking up here toward the front. So I went ahead and pulled it on off. And I was a little disappointed in the result. You can see here that some of that primer from the plug extension came loose and stuck to the mold. That primer did not stick to itself nearly as well as the primer stuck to the mold release on the mold. I can probably still get that primer off the mold surface, but now I'm pretty sure that that primer from the rattle can from Home Depot is not the thing to use. It's hard to get a good shine, a smooth surface on it, and apparently it doesn't stick to itself very well. I had to cheat a little bit here to start the release on this plug. I put a screw back into the end of the plug so I could pry it up. The reason I had to do that is there's a little edge almost all the way around this plug, and so there really is no spot that I can stick something sharp like a sharpened end of a stir stick under there. So I had to lift it just a little bit so I could get a stir stick under there. Then I could start working it loose. Let's fast forward through my struggles to get this plug released from the mold. Okay, here comes the big reveal. Oh, we have disappointment. Wow, I have a whole lot of lessons learned and things I want to try to do different on the next plug and mold that I do. But let's talk about what failed. We had a significant failure on the plug. If it hadn't been for that, I think everything else would have worked great. But if you remember back on the plug series, when I was making this plug, I had put down several layers of primer, and I had been a little bit unhappy with the shape of the nose. I didn't think it was quite right. So I put down another layer of drywall mud. I put the plug up on end, and I drug a form along there. And then I put down some more layers of primer. Well, where it failed was that layer of drywall mud I had between layers of primer. And that's because it was just mud. This mud does not have good adhesion. So that's where I had my failures. What would have been better would be to use a filler that would adhere better to the underlying primer layer, and then the overlaying primer layers would adhere to whatever the filler would be. So it would probably be something like a Bondo, a polyester filler. That probably would have been what would have worked well. That also leads me to think, and I thought this before when I was working on my plug extensions, drywall mud should be put on top the fiberglass with primer over that. I think some other kind of filler should be used for that. But drywall mud on the foam, filling in dents and dings and low spots, I think that's probably still a very viable and cheap filler. But that's probably the only place I will use drywall mud. Now, concerning the future of this plug, I am toying with the idea of tearing off this nose, sanding off all the primer on it, getting down to the lower level primer, and then trying to re-prime and polish again this leading edge, because I really would like to use this plug to do the other face. We'll see. But that's what I'm currently thinking about. I think the next thing to talk about is this little carrier that I made that I put the plug on in order to make the mold. I think this worked out pretty well. What was really nice is this plastic has enough pliability that when I was trying to pry the mold up, it came off of this plastic really easily. I mean, the plastic here was able to bend out a little bit and very easily separate. So I was really happy with the way that worked. Now, the only thing that didn't go quite the way I had hoped, on the edges of the plastic, I did not think about sealing those and putting release agent on them. So the epoxy, as I was making the mold, would run down over that edge, and then it would glue itself to that edge instead of the face. Now, it came off the face easy, and it didn't really cause a problem, but it was kind of annoying. So I'll try to make these edges be a little more easy to release next time. But for the most part, I really like this gizmo, and it'll be easy to take apart because I only use hot glue, and I can switch it around and use it for the other face. Now, these plug extensions were close to being a failure. Now, the idea of the screws coming through here and screwing into the end of my plug to attach them, I think that worked pretty well. I was pretty pleased with that. And I was pleased that I was able to get an edge between the plug and where the plug extension was. So that'll make it so it's easy when I make my part to see where that edge is so I know where to trim it. So that worked great. So that idea was good. Like I said before, these should have been longer. At least an inch, probably an inch and a half to 2 inches, how much longer they should have been. Maybe I should say wider. The primer I used that primer that you get from Home Depot in the little rattle cans. That stuff did not stick to itself at all well. And another thing is, it didn't gloss very well when I was trying to buff it. It didn't gloss very well when I tried to put the fairly fine sandpaper on it. Now, it could be that would have, but I can tell when I'm looking between the plug and the plug extension, looking at the surface, the plug itself is very shiny. I'm very happy with that. The plug extension is not shiny. It's kind of a satin color. So that's part of the reason I think that the primer kind of stuck to the mold. Now, it's not really a problem in the long run as far as this surface goes, except I do want to make sure that my tacky tape is going to be able to seal down where I've got mold and then some of this primer and then mold. So what I will probably end up doing is doing some sanding on this to try to get it down flush and then polishing it. And I think I'll be able to get a fairly good place for the seal for my tacky tape. And I'll probably go ahead and work on it back toward the plug also. Just because if I make a part on here, when I go to remove it, this primer is going to try to stick to it and stick it to the mold. I think that's probably what would happen. I wouldn't really care if this stuck to the part because it's going to get trimmed off. But I think I'm probably going to have to try to remove it. So if I reuse that plug, I want to reuse these plug extensions, but they're not usable the way they are. So I'm going to sand off all the primer and start over on priming. And I will probably go ahead and use the primer that I used on the plug, which is a polyester primer. And I'm going to seal off this foam side so I can spray the polyester primer on here and not affect the foam. So I'm going to have to put a layer of fiberglass, maybe a couple layer of fiberglass on here. And then when I go to use it, to keep the problem from happening again where fiberglass and epoxy would kind of come over here and adhere to this edge, I'm going to put a little bit of packing tape all the way around. That'll stick out a little bit, and that'll keep that problem from happening again. And the packing tape will only have to be maybe a quarter of an inch, maybe 3/16 of an inch up on here. I think that'll work fine. So these are going to have to be resurfaced. Let's talk about this mold. Now, one of the things I can see here in this shininess is there's print through. And I'm pretty sure it's print through from the plug because the plug had a little bit of print through visible. Now I put down that chopped mat first on here to try to keep any fiberglass print through from happening from the plain fibers back here. So it's really hard to say exactly where that print through came from, but I believe it came from the plug. Now it might be possible to polish this out. It's one of the things I'm going to be doing is polishing this in here to try to get rid of any print through. And there's another thing, and this was an experiment I didn't mention before, but the plug in a few areas had really, really small micro pores, just tiny little ones. And I thought about going ahead and sanding down that last layer of primer, actually it'd probably be about 2 layers of primer, to get rid of those micropores, put down another really wet coat and polishing that so I wouldn't have them. But then I thought, well, let's go ahead and leave those in there and see how bad it makes the plug stick to the mold. And I think it did, because I can feel those little pores. So that means the epoxy did go into those pores, and it was probably holding a little bit. And that's probably part of the reason I was having trouble getting this back edge free from the mold. Right here where I'm going to have the part surface, I'm not seeing any air bubbles. And I'm really pleased with the green showing up. That's kind of cool. I think I'll probably do that again. It's not a consistent green, but that's okay. I'm not really worried about that. That's just because when I was squeegeeing on, it got thin in some places and thicker than others, and that's fine. I'm not seeing any air pockets except possibly for right here, but over here on the flanges, especially on this one, I am seeing air pockets, and I'm not sure why that is. In fact, I can feel where the air pocket was between the fiberglass and my flange. So I'm going to have to fill that in. What I'll probably do is sand this with some 320 and protect this mold surface, and then put just a squeegee layer of epoxy on here and see if that fixes that issue. I probably will. It's worth a try. Can't hurt anything as long as I don't get anything here on this surface. Of course, I still have some trimming to do. That'll be pretty easy to do with that vibrating saw. I still have to remove the primer that came off the plug. I think that will come off fairly well. The question though is going to be, why did this stick so much that it caused the separation between the primer layers where that drywall mud was? So I'm going to have to take a closer look at this, if I can get this peeled off of here, and try to see if it was just roughness like I have here. I just didn't do good enough at sanding it down and buffing it. Or was it something else? Was it the funny shear force? Because I had to lift on this back edge. I couldn't lift on the front edge because the nose couldn't come up past this lip. So I had to lift on the back edge. And was that twisting force there, which is more of a shear. Back here it was a tension force lifting. Was that shear force an issue that caused this to break loose? That's something I'm going to try to figure out. I don't know if I'll ever come up with an answer for that. But once I get this peeled off, maybe I'll know. And I'll probably have to do a little bit of buffing in here to fix some little scratches. Oh, by the way, that toughened tooling epoxy that I used on here, so far I like it. Now, once I do buffing, maybe I'll decide I don't like it so well. But right now, I like it. One of the issues I have right now, it's not a big issue. I used 4 layers of that 320 gram per square meter E-glass here for my mold. And just coming along here, pressing in between where I have those ribs underneath, I can feel a little bit of bowing, particularly here in this bay. It's not bad though. I had to put quite a bit of pressure on it to get it to bow. So I think that instead of 4 layers, I probably should have gone with 6 layers. I think that would have helped me a little more. Now with 6 layers, this will be fairly stiff, and I think it will hold its shape if I have just this mold surface itself without all the reinforcement and support. I think I should have tried to remove this from the plug before I put on all the reinforcement and support. So when the plug was on here and I had that mold fiberglass on it, I should have peeled that off. It would have been a little bit easier to peel off because it would have been more flexible. Right now, this thing is really rigid, and so it was a little bit difficult to get off. So I think I probably should have peeled it off first, then laid it back on there, and then put the support on there. Another lesson learned here on this, let me move things just a little bit. I really did this support the hard way. What I think I'm going to do next time is get a big 4x4 sheet of that foam and get 1 or 2 layers. I haven't decided. This is 2 layers. I might try 1 layer and just get a big flat area and just make a panel. Put fiberglass on each side, let it cure. Then I'll have some nice panels that I can then cut these shapes out of. That would give me fiberglass already on each side, and then all I have to do is tab all the way around and give it some nice round edges. That will make it much easier, because when I did this, I was going for hours and hours and I got pretty darn tired. I should mention that the places where I got these air pockets over here on this flange are where I don't have that initial thick coat of the green epoxy. So where that green epoxy is, it looks great. Past that is where I have problems. So what I need to remember next time is just to make sure that green epoxy coat, that thick coat that I put down first before I put down that chopped mat, needs to go all the way out. So that's a lesson learned. What do I have left to do here? I need to go ahead and clean up these edges on these flanges. They're already pretty much cleaned up here on these edges. I need to go ahead and finish removing this primer here. I'm going to buff out this surface. I'm going to do what I can to get the primer off at least out here on the very edge where my tacky tape has to go, but I will give it a shot at cleaning out a little bit farther in. One thing I'm thinking of doing is on the back side where I have those short ribs in between here, I'm thinking of putting a couple layers in there just to make this a little bit thicker and a little bit stiffer. I haven't decided if I'm going to do that yet. And then I think it's going to be time to start testing with this thing. I'm really anxious to start getting in there and start doing that. Well, that's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. We've got more on the way. See you next time.